The Lifestyle Show, presented by Selena Mackenzie.
Now, I'm just going to let our first guest tell us all about this, because Serena Kochinski is the daughter of Paul, who was heir to the famous Kochinski jewellery company. And she's here to tell us about an egg. So welcome to the show, Serena. Yes. First of all, what is the Kochinski jewellery company, that if people don't know?
So my family were formerly the head of the House of Kutchinsky, which was a very famous British jeweller up until it was sold, which is part of the story that we'll get to, in 1991. But it was about 100 years old. It had become the British equivalent of Cartier. We made fabulous pieces for royalty, celebrities, pop stars. We had shops in Knightsbridge and on Bond Street and even in Switzerland at one point. So, it was a very, growing up in that sort of dynasty was a very sort of gilded existence. But you don't really notice it when you're a child because it's just normal life.
Yeah, of course you don't. I suppose you were too young to be wearing any of the jewellery, but I guess your mother did she?
Oh, yes. I mean, I was given a few pieces, actually. Fortunately, I still have one from when I was a child, a bracelet that my father made for me. One of his nicknames for me was Bear. Oh. And I think because I've got this big curly hair that he had. And it's a gold and diamond bracelet with bears on. And actually, that kind of sums up a lot of my father's design aesthetic. He was very playful, and animals had actually always been sort of signature Kochinski pieces. They sell at auction now for sort of tens of thousands, and are actually, I'm told, the 70s period is very, very fashionable right now, which is obviously great, in terms of having written a book about them. But yes, these sort of animal brooches, tigers, rabbits with kind of demonic teeth, hummingbirds with mother of pearl beaks, and also a sort of, they were very known for a style of gold jewellery that was very chunky, big cocktail rings, quite kind of boundary pushing, quite androgynous, which was something very new. Rings. My grandfather had a collection of gold cocktail rings that he would wear, and sort of looking at jewellery across the gender divide. So, it was a very innovative jeweller. And I think because we were a family of Jewish immigrants, we weren't sort of weighed down by tradition in the way that some other sort of more classic jewellery houses might be. But that came with its own set of challenges as well.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. Because did your grandfather start it, and was he from Poland?
So it was actually my great-great-grandfather. So when I was writing my book, it was this incredible opportunity to kind of really connect with my ancestors, who obviously I knew very, very little about. I knew that my great-grandfather was called Moshe Aaron because actually the business's official limited name was M.A. Kochinski Limited. So it always had his initials at the fore. But aside from that, they were very sort of shadowy figures from the past. And I found myself sort of charting their journey from Poland, where they came in 1893, and how they got to London, which in itself was an epic, adventure, very likely traveling without papers. They were fleeing the pogroms, persecution of the Jewish people were facing from the Russian Empire at the time. A set of laws had been passed that made it very difficult for Jewish people to earn a good living, and they could only live in certain places, all sorts of things. So initially, the story goes that they were heading for America, the Golden Medina, the land of the free. But, and the myth that we were always told was that my great-great-grandfather Hershey got scammed on the way, and that's how he ended up in London. Someone sold him a fake ticket or something. But when I looked into it, actually, this was fairly common. And the more prosaic truth was probably that he just ran out of money. And so London was always a sort of a stop-off, really, for him. But over time, he started fixing watches and silverware at the kitchen table, of fellow Jews who'd made the journey, and their watch had got broken, their candlesticks were battered. He started off there, really. And then his son, Moshe, my great-grandfather, had the first shop. And then there was a bigger shop on Commercial Road, right in the heart of the Jewish East End. They started to build a name, and then it was my grandfather, Joseph, who really took it to the next level, if you like, moved it up to the West End, a very controversial move at the time.
Really? Was it not the thing to do?
Well, Well, they'd become the jeweller of the East End, you see, and there was quite a lot of competition. There was an area called Black Lion Yard where there were loads of jewellers, but they had this prime location. And Moshe, my great-grandfather, he was a very religious man. You know, he was a good businessman, but he was very respected and he had great trust in his community. So he started allowing brides-to-be to take rings home, engagement rings, to try on a few.
How
to decide
trusting.
which one. Well, exactly. And then my grandfather, who was his youngest son, he was very sort of street smart and very ambitious. So he turned his sort of father's goodwill gesture, if you like, into a marketing technique. And so Kochinski's, was the only jeweler that offered this service. And that's how it built up. I mean, I meet many people still, whose parents, grandparents, they all bought their engagement rings from Kutchinsky. And it's fabulous to have that sort of heritage, basically, and to hear that, it brings it back. It means, in a way, the business may well be gone now, but the legacy of it will always be alive because jewelry lasts, beyond everything, really, has an immortality we
Absolutely.
as mere humans do not. So, yes, it was totally fascinating tracing their journey. And I also discovered, I sort of moved to London's East End, I think in the end of my 20s, largely because I really liked the idea of this sort of creative hub in London that it had become, not knowing that that was exactly where my ancestors had landed, a century before. And the reason I was even in a position to make decisions like that and to be an independent, financially independent person was because of all their hard work. So it was very humbling. I felt a real debt of gratitude to them.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I mean, it's quite fun tracing your family tree anyway, but with your backstory, it must have been amazing.
Well, it was, yeah. So, I mean, what I was trying to do, the whole journey, the whole process was devised around the idea of why did my father risk everything to make the world's largest jeweled egg? And this egg then brought down, a business, destroyed our family, and ultimately sort of broke him. And he died a decade after its completion.
No.
Thinking that his greatest creation had been a failure, really, because it failed to sell and it wreaked such havoc. So I had sort of spent my adult life, he died when I was 20 and I'm now in my 40s. So it had been this sort of question hanging over us and sort of clouded by grief and loss and all of these things. So I started out just trying to piece together the context from which his sort of grand madcap idea would have been born. And I suppose, I studied history at university and I'm fascinated by these things. So I decided that I'd trace it all the way back. I'm not going to lie, when I was in the middle of the writing process and I realized I was dealing with, 100 years of history, I did wonder whether I could have just started it in 1950 at some point. But it was a very satisfying process.
So what happened to the egg then? I mean, it's a sad story because I know that, like you say, your father died and the mum and dad's marriage fell apart and it must have been tough for you. But what happened to the egg?
So, well, that's the question. And it was, again, a sort of interesting process because, like I said, for me, initially, it was kind of trying to understand my father. But as I went further into, in investigating his motives, people kept asking me, where is it? And at first I was just like, oh, look, I don't need to know. It's lost. It's probably for the best, let it stay buried. And that was certainly, my mum, probably felt like that as well, I think. Well, she definitely did at first. It was a very painful period of her life, understandably. So it was a sort of over time, I realized I couldn't ignore that question any longer. And actually, I found myself feeling very emotional about the idea that a part of my father was out there somewhere, even if it was just an inanimate, large gold object, by, digging deeper and deeper into the past and into our history. Somehow, for me, that egg came to embody him. And there was a conversation, right towards the end where I'd almost found it or had found it. And, but we're still trying to explain to people that I was, I didn't have a claim of ownership. I didn't want to get any money for this thing or, take it home with me. Wouldn't really fit. But I just needed to see it. I just wanted, it was the only piece of him I had left, Yeah. And it's his legacy and I want the world to know about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And dare I ask, do you know what it's worth now?
Well, he valued it at 7 million. And it sold for something near that figure, about a decade later. And then since then, there are in the egg, it's 15 kilograms of gold. It's 2 foot tall. There's 24,000 diamonds, and 20 of those are pinks. Mm-hmm. And pink diamonds are the world's rarest diamonds. And they came from a mine in Western Australia, the Argyle mine, that was for 30 years was the world's sort of biggest supply of pinks. There hadn't been a supply like that ever in the history of, recorded history of the world and the jewelry industry. So it was a very sort of unique freak of nature, really, that those diamonds emerged there. And then they've run out, they've stopped. So there are no more of these diamonds, and that obviously boosts the price. I mean, I've had estimates of around 30 million. I've had one estimate of 100 million, and I think the point is the scarcity factor means that the value will rise and rise. But when I was looking for it, I was sort of really worried and kept being told by people in the industry that there was a strong likelihood that the egg would have been melted down and would no longer exist. Yes, because of the stone, you see, because someone, who bought it or had inherited it might want to just get the stones out and cash them in because they're worth so much money. So, it was a very real threat. And in fact, at one point, someone did tell me that had happened. They'd obviously they'd been wrongly informed. I don't think it was in any way, they weren't trying to hurt me, but that was just what they believed. And again, I found myself in tears. I mean, it sounds, bizarre. I totally accept. But it was a very emotional process, really.
I don't think it does sound bizarre. Like you say, it's your attachment to your father. I mean, that'd break my heart, and it's not my father.
It was really upsetting.
Awful.
So to see it again intact, when I did in 2023, when I finally found it after, many dead ends and, engaging private investigators and consulting an art detective and sending emails to pretty much everyone in Argyle, because I figured they'd eventually sold it in 2002. But they just were unable to pass on the name of the person they'd sold it to. So it was a very frustrating period. And at one point, someone said, look, OK, maybe I'll be able to pass a letter for you. Maybe through the channels, we can get it to the owner, explaining your desire to see it again. And so I got so close. And then he came back and said, we're really sorry. The guy that bought it originally has passed away and we don't know where it is now. So that was, almost totally. And they were like, sort of, maybe it's time for you to give this up, move on.
No,
but I didn't. And then eventually, like all these things, if you hack away at something for long enough, you eventually get a lucky break, don't you? So eventually it was like a Christmas miracle, Selena. I mean, I'd engaged these investigators. Between you and I had there was no way I could afford their services. But I'd been made redundant. So I had a small amount of money, which I don't think my husband wanted me to spend on hunting down a massive jeweled egg. But anyway, I sent them it was enough to inspire me to send them request a meeting. And we had a chat, and then they sent me a scoping email. And in the scoping email, which arrived just before Christmas in 2022, they revealed that the egg had actually been donated to a museum and was no longer in a private collection, where basically any hope of seeing it never going to happen. So I couldn't believe it. And then they added that it was about to go on display, as a temporary display while they work out, the museum gets the funds together to put it on permanent display and pay for all the insurance. So it was a sort of suddenly out of nowhere 2-week window where I had to get on a plane and go to Japan and I could see the egg. And it sounds, like it was a lucky break, but it doesn't feel like it because you've been on the journey for so long.
Yeah, hindsight's a wonderful thing. If you'd have just waited till that date, you could have saved yourself a lot of time.
Exactly. And then honestly, it just kept going, these things keep happening. So then at the last minute, the museum, who'd been wonderful and granted me like a private audience with it on the Monday, and I was going to meet the buyers, the people who donated it. And suddenly they got spooked and decided that I wasn't Serena Kochinski. I was a hostile actor who posing as me, who was going to steal the egg.
Oh, wow. You couldn't make it up.
No, I mean, their concern was totally legitimate. Another researcher that I'd been working with out of total good faith had contacted them, wires were crossed, and they just, I mean, it's in the Museum of Nature and Science in Tokyo, which is like the Natural History Museum in the UK, which is somewhat incongruous. And they have exhibits in there, like massive cages of, space meteorites, airplanes, all sorts of sciencey things. This is the first massive jeweled item that they'd had, so they weren't used to dealing with the insurance, worries. And yes, I went through a lot of rigmarole. My birth certificate and passport were not enough; they could be too easily forged. I called the embassy. I mean, well, we got there in the end, thank goodness. But yes, it was hairy at the last minute.
Well, I can see what has gone into the book. It's such a story. It's such an interesting story for you to have finally got there, and it sounds like his obsession sort of became your obsession.
I mean, I guess it did. That's sort of, when I came to sit down and to sort of think about the conclusion, that was the conclusion that I arrived at, really, that, I had inherited from him that sort of, my husband calls it shooting for the moon.
Yeah, but you got it in the end.
Yes, well, exactly. Dogged determination sometimes, leads you down, yes. I mean, my father was sort of ambitious, eccentric, sometimes self-destructive. And I suppose I was trying to work out which bits of my own personality were sort of inherited from him, as well as, trying to resurrect the inheritance of his legacy of Kochinski's egg, or the Argyll Library Egg by Kochinski, to give it its official title.
That's its official title. Well, it's a fascinating story. For our listeners, the book is called Kochinski's Egg, a family story of love, loss and obsession. It's by Serena Kochinski, who we're chatting to now. And as always, we're selling it on our website, TRE.radio. Now, I don't think you have a website, do you, Serena? But are you on social media if people want to find out more?
Yes, I am on social media. I'm very much on Instagram particularly, and there is a House of Kochinski Instagram account where there's lots of updates about the book. I'm on there as well. I'm also on X and Blue Sky. So, please do. If if any listeners have got questions or want to know more about the story, please do get in touch.
Wow.
And, if you want to buy any offers for the egg, we'll have to discuss.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I think your dad will be proud of you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.